Welcome to the Atlas Talks with your host, Deborah Atlas. Yancy Caruthers served 20 years in the U.S. Army Reserves as an Army medic and trauma nurse, saving wounded soldiers from death in critical condition. The Army called upon him 3 times to serve, once to Fort Riley, Kansas, and twice to Iraq. After his military career, he served his country as a diplomat with the U.S. Department of State. He's author of the Medic series and Northwest of Eden, a memoir about his experience as the second in command of an Army emergency department during the Iraq War.
Hi, welcome to another episode of the Atlas Talks, Engaging with Depression, and my guest today is Yancy Caruthers. Thank you for being here, Yancy. Appreciate it. Yancy.
Thank you, Deborah.
You're welcome. Yancy is a veteran, and you joined the Army at 17. You're a 20-year veteran of the Army. You had 2 deployments in Iraq, and but you've had an amazing career. You were an officer, you were a paramedic, and you were a nurse. And then you were a U.S. diplomat in Lima, Peru, and to the Bahamas. And I want to talk about how you made that kind of transition. You're a business owner and you're a military author, which is very different for me. And I'm very interested to talk with you about your books. Your first book is Northwest of Eden. And then your second book is actually a series of 6 books collected called Medic. And it's a collection of stories about real Army medics in each U.S. war from World War II through Afghanistan. You've received the Yahoo Spotlight Award, and you are somewhat of a trailblazer. And I want to talk with you about one of the trailblazing that you did, because you organized a panel that addressed issues that veterans and employers are facing, making the transition into life and business, integrating, retaining, developing, and really working with employers and veterans to have it be a success. So let's start with, you were in the Army for 20 years, and as a medic, as a paramedic, as a nurse, you saw a lot. And given that the focus of what I look at is depression and the factors that lead to that, can you speak to that a bit? Because war is so phenomenally hard on veterans, both during and after. So I'd like to have you speak to that just a little bit, if you would.
I think so. And just to correct the record for any of my paramedic friends that are watching, I never did attain that certification. I was an Army medic, but I wasn't a paramedic.
My apologies.
So the only reason that is in case one of my friends is watching and you were never a paramedic. I think with any sort of medical trauma, military wartime service, and kind of roll all of that in together as defined as an experience that resets your bar of normal. I mean, when we wake up every morning, we have a certain expectation of normalcy. You're going to get up and you're going to go to work and you're going to, accomplish certain tasks, and, then you eat and you nap and whatever it is that you do throughout the day. And I make it sound incredibly, the everyday person's normal work day is pretty boring by comparison to this new wartime service, military service of normal, where the goal is really just to get through the day without anybody dying. And you don't really know what that's going to look like when you wake up in the morning. So, and one thing I'm sure that, that you're familiar with, our brains are just this big collection of chemicals that we program it to have a certain response. So, when you see something funny, you laugh. It's a physical response.
Right.
When you feel sad, you cry. It's a physical response. So it's very much not necessarily something that you can control. But what we do is, when we reset our level of normal, we've reprogrammed our brains to become accustomed to it. There's a cartoon that it always amuses me. In my first deployment, I was stationed in a place called LSA Anaconda, And that's pretty much where my pillow and blanket were, but I was all over. And LSA Anaconda was subject to mortar attack pretty much every day.
Yeah.
And that was the installation is about 3 miles wide and 5 miles long. So if you can imagine, for something, a mortar is going to land in there somewhere. And the majority of that is just wide open space. It's going to land somewhere where you can hear it. You may be able to see it, probably not. Sometimes you don't even hear the attack, you just hear the alarm go off. Every once in a while, you do hear the boom, and the boom gets closer and closer to you, and that's pretty scary.
Yeah.
So it becomes this thing that when I first start telling the story, people are like, well, how terrifying. I mean, you're just walking along the sidewalk, and 3 days after I arrived, I'm walking along the sidewalk, and the alarms go off, and I'm looking for a hole to hide in, and there's nothing to hide in, and something blows up, and it's right next to me. The first time that happened, it's a terrifying experience. It's, the adrenaline rush, the body chemistry gets going, fight or flight, we're going to do something. The last week I was in country, I was sitting in my office, of course, so all the windows sandbagged up. And I hear the alarms go off again, and there was a mortar that was actually shot out of the sky with some of our defensive systems for that sort of thing, happened right over the top of my office. And I didn't even think about it. I kept working. And because over a period of time, I had become conditioned to that happening ever so often. And I think that anything that you can really apply that paradigm to anything that we do, you reach a certain level of stress or a certain level of trauma, and it becomes normal.
Yeah.
And our brains adjust to that. We're very adjustable creatures in that regard. But what I think also where part of the thing happens where we all become disconnected is that all of a sudden I went from that level of normal. 24 hours later, I'm in my living room. And I'm sitting there in the quiet. I had a hard time sleeping because there were no generators running in the background. I had become so used to that background noise over a period of months and months that I couldn't sleep, because all of a sudden I'm out in the middle of the woods and it's quiet and I hear the frogs and the crickets, and I'm thinking, what is happening to me? Because my brain had become used to functioning chemically and physically at a certain level, and now all of a sudden all that was gone.
Yeah.
So my return to the old normal, it had all sorts of little bumps and adjustments and things that would happen, and then something would stimulate a thought or a memory, and it would try to bring my brain back to where that old normal was. So that's something that I feel like, I don't know, at first it took a while, but at first certain sounds would bring my heart rate up, as though we were getting ready to do something. There was going to be a panic, not really a panic response, but sort of my body revving up the engine, getting ready to respond to something. But that stimulus was artificial, because it might be a sound that only resembled another sound.
Right.
The engine brake on a truck sounds like a mortar as it's coming in over your head. There's a resemblance in those two sounds. So I would be sitting in my driveway and I would hear a big truck on the road, and I would hear the engine brake, and just that sound would trigger my mind to thinking, I need to get into a hole somewhere. Now, I knew consciously that that sound was not a mortar. I mean, I didn't have a flashback. It was just a sound, that's a physiological response. I knew right away what it was. But then it took a second for my heart rate to come back down. It took several minutes for saying, okay, it's not really something that I need to respond to, but my body's already here. Now I have to wait for it to settle back down here. It doesn't happen to me much anymore. I've been away from that environment now for 13 years, but every once in a while, I'll notice that my heart rate will jump 20 points because I've heard something or I've seen something or something reminded me of being there. And I don't think it's at all abnormal. I think we reach a point where we train our body to react to generate and react to a certain sort of chemistry that sort of becomes this self-licking ice cream cone. I mean, when we're happy, we produce happy chemicals. When we have the happy chemicals, we're happy. So it becomes this sort of perpetuating cycle. I think the same thing, with a depressed person or an anxious person, the emotion itself produces the set of chemicals that are appropriate for that situation, and then your body then reacts to those, and it becomes sort of a cycle. I think that happens with happy people, it happens with depressed people, it happens with angry people, it happens with anxious people. And I think that the solution to breaking out of any one of those cycles it's always the same. It's a conscious effort to say, okay, I know this isn't really happening. So let me try to condition my response to what really is happening rather than what my mind is telling me. Fireworks were a big issue for about 5 years.
Yeah.
Every time I'd be in a big fireworks show, you hear the sound. I'm looking at it. I know it's fireworks. The fireworks aren't making me afraid. But my body's doing this because it in some sort of subconscious level, it's taking me back to that. So what I would have to do is tell myself ahead of time almost and try to consciously get my body to respond the way it wanted. It doesn't always work, but it was sort of one of the games we used to play in the Army when you would hear gunfire or you would hear ammunition. It sounds like a sick game, it really is. We would say, oh, that's an AK-47, or that's friendly, or that's enemy, or that's this type of munition, or that's an 81 millimeter mortar, and we would play this sort of sick game when we'd hear something. Of course, the new guys thought we were crazy.
Right.
But what we were doing, without even realizing it in playing this game, we were tuning our minds to instantly recognize, oh, that's a bad sound. Versus this sound is, well, maybe it's bad, but it's a little more comfortable when it's your own gunfire of your guys that you hear.
Yeah.
And I started to play that same game with when I would hear firecrackers, or I live right next door to the police firing range over here, which may have been a bad decision, but I hear gunfire in the distance all the time. I recognize the sound and I say, oh, that's what it is. And I sort of play that game with myself and say, oh, that's a firecracker. Oh, that's a gunshot from the police range. So I'm trying to identify the sound and then sort of condition my body to have the appropriate reaction to it. I realized just now that from your original question, we have gone way over here somewhere. So I'll turn it back to you and we'll get back to it.
One of the things as a journalist is that I ask a question, I let people talk because they tell me all kinds of things I might not know to ask about. So that's really fine. But I want to kind of piggyback on what you said, because what I've written about, what I've talked about is perception. People with depression have a perception about what happened that ends up having them go into a tailspin and go into depression. And what you've done is a perfect illustration of that, which is perception isn't necessarily what is. And being able to identify what is helps you step back from what I call the depression pit, helps you step back from PTSD, which is trying to flirt with you really hard. And, what you do is brilliant. And that game, it may seem a little sick to some, but to me, it makes perfect sense because it allows you to step back and recognize what is, as opposed to the fear grabbing onto you and just throwing you over. So I think it's actually really brilliant that you guys did that and that you still continue to do that. It's a very healthy thing.
I think so.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, that's okay. Go ahead and finish it.
Oh, we have a little bit of a time delay here. I stumbled over that a little bit.
I noticed that. Tell me about what had you write your book, Northwest of Eden, and why the name?
Well, there were a couple of reasons for the name. First, I thought it was just a little bit catchy as a play on the novel East of Eden that came back way back when. But I was stationed in a place called Al-Assad, which is northwest of the intersection between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, which, according to biblical lore, was where the Garden of Eden would have been.
Right.
The intersection of the four rivers, two of which were the Tigris and the Euphrates. So that's kind of where we were. We were northwest of Eden, and I thought that was a little bit of a catchy name. Now, in terms of writing this book, the journey was probably a little more interesting than most autobiographicals. I think what people do in general is that they have an experience, and then they decide later, hey, I'm going to write about that because that was an incredible experience. This happened completely differently than that. It was, I knew I was going to have an experience, so I decided to write it along the way. In very much struggled a little bit with how do I do this? Do I do a journalistic perspective? Do I just, try to keep it an internal, or how do I do it? And I finally just said, I'm overthinking this. Just get down in front of the keyboard and just let it spill out and see what happens. I knew based on, I did back-to-back deployments. So I was there for a year. I came home for 7 or 8 months, just had almost adjusted myself back to being a real person again. There we go, right back again. And so I knew based on that previous experience that I was going to have new and intense experiences. I just didn't know what they were going to be. I had no idea what was going to be in the book when I started writing it, which was a sort of an interesting way to do things. But what I discovered fairly quickly was that I was second in command of an emergency room in a hospital that basically served Western Iraq. Our primary mission was soldiers and Marines, but occasionally we'd get civilians that maybe they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. The government has a fairly extensive set of rules for when we should and should not treat people in our hospitals, because of course we can't just treat everybody that walks in the door, or that's not what we're there for. Yeah. But I knew that we were going to have this big variety of experiences, but what I didn't realize was just how much waiting there was in the middle. So we would sit around some all day long and play cards, and then maybe nothing at all would happen for days and days. And then you might have a day that would be just back to back, patients coming in, trauma, civilians, soldiers, Marines, whatever. And it would also vary on what the forces on the battlefield were actually doing. I mean, if they were actively involved in certain operations, we would have to be at the ready because something might happen to them. But there was a lot of waiting in between. A lot of just absolute ridiculous things that we did just to pass the time. And the book Northwest of Eden talks about this a little bit. We would play these dastardly sick pranks on each other because we didn't have anything better to do.
Yeah.
But then at the time, then the time it comes time to go to work, it's time to go to work. But then the work might last an hour, and then it might just not be happening at all. So I tried to write about some of those things as well, and to really expand on the personalities of the people that were there. There were all of the characters are based on real people. Sometimes I get the names mixed up. There's the one character is actually a combination of 3 different people rolled together just for simplicity. But all this stuff in viewed through that lens, all the stuff in Northwest of Eden really happened. What I see years after the experience, and then in writing the book, I didn't read it myself, cover to cover, for almost 3 years after I wrote it. I would read pieces of it. I was familiar intimately with every part of it, but I didn't sit down at the beginning and read it through to the end.
I understand that completely. In writing my own book,
What I realized,
I didn't read it all the way through until I finally finished it. And then for the first time, I read the whole thing.
I think I had sold 5,000 copies before I finished Thor the Red Lion. It was an odd experience to do that with the continuity of sitting down for 3 hours and just reading it from start to finish.
Yeah.
And that was when I had the realization that Northwest of Eden was also a reflection of my psychological growth and my personal journey through that. And I could tell by the end of the book how much different of a person that I had become through the experience. I would read some of the earlier chapters and I'm thinking, wow, what an arrogant jerk that I was. I loved my job. I had been an ER nurse at the time for a number of years. I had seen a lot of things on the civilian side. I knew how to deal with an emergency, and I had the mentality to deal with it. When things fall apart, I was usually the guy in the room that panicked last. So you'd start to see people in the room that just start to become paralyzed. I was usually the last guy that happened to. And I'd like to think that while I still had a whole lot of stuff to learn at the time, but I was fairly good at my job. But I came across that way to myself when I went back to read it. I thought, wow. And then as a period of time goes on, I just saw the river kept washing over the sharp rocks until there were just certain things and certain parts that were muted. And I think what that allowed me to express is the observations of other people. When you know you're taking a picture of something, you see something beautiful, you think, wow, I see something beautiful. But when you think, I'm going to drive over there, witness something beautiful, and take a picture of it, well, that changes your perspective and by which you look at it. And the same is true with writing. If you know that you're going to have a conversation where you're going to write about it, it changes, even during the course of this interview. The idea of intentional journalism versus accidental journalism, it will change your perspective on how you want to approach those things and how you want to see that. And I think with what you talk about with depression and other, emotional, I don't really care for the word disorder, but I mean, I suppose any deviation from normal, whatever. But any sort of alteration in perspective that we have, once you start to view things through that lens, then everything is viewed through that lens. I think you approach things differently. If a person is depressed, I've struggled a couple of times in my life with some pretty serious depression. Fortunately, short-term episodes, but understanding that you fight with a deadline. You lay there because it feels like there's a 50-pound weight on your chest keeping you in bed.
Yeah.
You don't really want to get up and deal with the thing that is the deadline. But at the same time, you sit there in bed, you can't sleep, and you worry about the deadline. So it becomes sort of this lens that you look at everything through, and then that's what it looks like. That's what it is. And with something that you said earlier, the perception of something isn't necessarily what that something is. And oddly, we do this day after day after day. What we're doing is we're reprogramming our brains to generate and accept a certain type of chemistry. And that becomes very, very difficult to overcome because we see events that happen, we see things, and it's always through the color of that lens of depression or that lens of anxiety. Now, the solution to that in the moment is always the same. Get up and do the thing. Now, we know this on a conscious level. It doesn't make it easy. I mean, I know I need to go out and climb on a roof today. Now, that's the easy part, is knowing that that's what I got to go up there and do. Still pretty sore from yesterday. So, yeah, I'm going to approach the tasks today viewed through the lens of yesterday. And I think maybe that there's an analogy there somewhere that ultimately the solution is still the same. Even though we're sore from yesterday, we have a job to do. This only ends positively one way, and that's get up and do the thing. And sometimes that was the thing that I would say to myself when I would find myself in the position of this situation that I've gotten myself into is very, very bad. When I first owned the business, it was just so overwhelming. Well, when you're a business owner, you can't fire yourself, you can't quit, whatever it is that you're stuck with. All of a sudden, I have this thing that is just this overwhelming set of problems that I must deal with. And what I found myself is that it's a whole lot easier just to sleep late, because then you don't have to deal with it.
Yeah.
But then once I'm awake, there I am sitting, staring at the ceiling, going, I need to get up and do this. And then it becomes almost the stages of grief. At first, you deny that you really have to do it, and then you start bargaining with it. It's like you hit the snooze alarm, and you think, I can still get up and do what I have to do, and then the snooze goes off again, and you hit it again, and well, I won't wash my hair or brush my teeth. I can still do it. And you start making all these little deals with yourself, and then you start saying, okay, it's 9 o'clock in the morning. I'm not out of bed yet. But if I don't do this thing that I have to do until 2, then I can lay here and be unconscious, and I don't have to think about this for a while until but you keep making these deals with yourself, and the deal just keeps getting worse and worse.
Yes.
And ultimately, the solution, and sometimes I would just have to say, this is not going to stop. This horrible feeling, this horrible crushing weight is not going to stop on its own. And this is a chemistry that I am continuing to produce by laying here and wallowing in it.
Yeah.
The only way this stops is get up, get dressed, put your boots on, go do the thing that you say you don't have to do till 2. And then all of a sudden, once you get some momentum, okay, that wasn't as bad.
Right. Like thinking about it is much worse than the actual doing, always.
Very much so. And I think that it applies to so many different mental health things. I think that people generally believe that mental health issues largely are imaginary. To quote Dumbledore in Harry Potter, just because it's all in your head, Harry, doesn't mean it isn't real.
That's right. That's exactly right.
But I think that there is a certain component that is this self-perpetuating brain chemistry, so that when you start to see the world through a red lens, everything is red from there on out.
Yeah.
And it becomes, you have to consciously and willfully make a decision to get out of bed. Or in terms of addiction, no one makes a person pick it up and drink it. That doesn't mean that there isn't a whole level of physical and chemical complexities that are around that. In the end, this action is very conscious. And the same thing with depression, the act of getting out of bed. No one's gonna do it for you. It's not gonna happen automatically. In the end, it requires a conscious effort to do or not do something. And I think that because there is that component to it, I think a lot of people don't understand that our brain chemistry is just this incredibly complex thing that we are somewhat enslaved to. See something funny, you laugh. It's involuntary. Sometimes you can suppress that, sometimes not. You know, you experience something sad, you cry. It's a very physiological response. I mean, our bodies react to how we have programmed them. When we teach ourselves continually that things aren't funny, then we stop laughing. When we have continually, if you get a hug every day from a family member or a friend, unconsciously you're conditioning yourself that you are loved, you are accepted. This is good brain chemistry, and then that good brain chemistry makes us feel better about it. So one of the things that I do now, and this is sort of an odd place for me to be in my life. For most of my working years, my job was largely intellectual. There were physical components to it. Of course, you know, flight nursing is a very physical job. It's also very mental job. And then as a diplomat, of course, I'm behind a desk. I'm not doing a whole lot physical at all. When I left that lifestyle, right now, every chance I get to be outside, I'm outside. I'm doing something with my hands. I sort of converted the business into sort of a residential remodeling construction. I flip houses. What we're sitting in right now is the one that eventually I'm going to live in. And I'm looking at these marvelous red oak floors that I put down that still have to be sanded and stained and all of these things. So there's this overwhelming thing in front of me. But then at the same time, I get a lot of feedback about that to myself to think, oh, you know, these floors look great. And they're even better the more of this effort that I put into it.
Right.
So that's what I do now. And oddly enough, I'm happy. I don't feel like I'm at work. Even when I'm doing work for a customer, I mean, it's being self-employed is kind of an interesting, conundrum. But my dad always said 98% of your customers only cause 2% of your problems, and the 2% cause the other 98%. Figure out who those 2% of your customers are and fire them. Do not do anything for them anymore. Just
I like
just
it.
out of your lives.
Smart
There's another
man.
analogy there.
Smart
I don't
man.
know what it is exactly, but I feel like we're at the cusp of another analogy for that being true of a whole lot of other things. To be able to think that, okay, all of my problems are caused by a very small percentage of external factors, toxic family members, my own behaviors, all of these things that we want to put in that little basket that ultimately result in this mountain of manure that we have to deal with over here. So if we can figure out what here these things are and can start to cut those out. And of course, the hardest part, I mentioned our own behaviors, our own problems that we ourselves cause.
Yeah.
Every bad situation I've ever been in, I put myself there in one way or another. And that's the hardest part, being able to take that and cut it out. So what I do every day, I get out in the sun. What I do is physical. So I'm generating positive body chemistry by doing physical exercise, by being in the sunlight. But really, it's all about enjoying what I do on a day-to-day basis. I wake up on a weekend when I don't have to be anywhere. And by the time 7:30 rolls around, I'm thinking, well, I could go and do this work. And I end up working 7 days a week. And then eventually, well, I'm 50 years old, so my body says,
Maybe not.
let's not do that today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
And then oddly, the conundrum there is what is good for me mentally wears me out physically. And what wears me out physically, it's sort of, they keep pushing and pulling against each other. So when I'm completely exhausted and tired and I can't move anymore, that's where mentally I'm way up here. And then when I rest myself and okay, now I'm physically ready to go to work, mentally I'm not where I need to be. I have to get out and go so that I can bring that back into some sort of equilibrium.
You've found the dance for yourself that a lot of people continue to seek. And
it absolutely
very well.
is. It absolutely is a dance, and it's absolutely in being able to develop ways that you don't get stuck in this perpetuating cycle in the pit of depression or the grip of anxiety or whatever you want to call it. So whatever it is, you don't just keep spinning on that particular hamster wheel.
Yeah.
You have to come up with something that says, okay, I know what this hamster wheel is good for, and like, all right, I'm getting some exercise, but I'm not going anywhere, and I need to get off of this and do something else. And the only way to do that is that conscious piece somewhere. There's a conscious piece of effort that says, get up, put your boots on. This only ends one way. And the one way is not laying in here in bed for another 15 minutes, bargaining with myself, telling me that I can kick some other tasks down the road, because then that just increases the task load for the following day. It never gets any better.
I'd say it a little differently, and I love how you've said it. I tend to translate what people say into how I speak it. And for me, it's about giving yourself permission and or not giving yourself permission to lie in bed or get up. Determination is a huge factor. And when you're dealing with depression, those two things are just this massive morass. And sorting it out, it can be very difficult. But when you sort it out, suddenly things start to flow and move forward.
You're absolutely correct. I mean, it is a giving yourself permission to do something or not to do something. It's basically just saying, okay, this is not healthy to do this. I'm going to stop doing it in an hour. I mean, you can't.
Yeah, no, I understand. I understand, because that gives you a time frame, and when that's done, you get, okay, great, I'm done now. Let's move on.
Right. You have to just avoid continuing to alter the bargain as the hour comes up. Well, and you hit the snooze alarm of your state of mind. You allow yourself to do this harmful, toxic thing just a little bit longer, not because it feels good, but because it's just sort of the rut that you're in. And it absolutely ends with a conscious effort to stop doing the thing that you're doing or start doing the thing that you're doing. And that without that, it's everything else is all just window dressing. Ultimately, it comes down to, I'm going to get up. I'm going to engage today. Now, the one thing that I do have to say about this, and this is something that I feel very personally about, because when I would allow myself to reach that cycle of the pit, when I'm sitting down in the pit, sometimes you crawl out of the pit and you realize that what you see around you doesn't look all that great. Sometimes when you wake up in the morning and you're in a good mood, but then 30 minutes later you're in a bad mood, that's not chemical. That's environmental. There's a stark difference there between I'm depressed, so I feel bad, and my life sucks, so I feel bad. And being able to recognize those, sometimes it gets really blurry. So when we reach a point where we are able to say, I'm going to get up, I'm going to put my boots on. Well, then you put your boots on and you go to a job that you hate. Well, maybe you got to get rid of the job that you hate. So there may be some very nebulous obstacles to getting out of the pit, but there also may be some very real obstacles to getting out of the pit. Very difficult to see the real when you're looking through the lens of your perception. So it may be that it's time for a career change.
Yeah.
Or it's time to start distancing myself from a toxic friend or a toxic family member. Or maybe it's time to reestablish some relationships somewhere that I've sort of let fall by the wayside because of maybe some other things that I had dealing with that I don't want to. But maybe it's time to strengthen some of those things. Maybe it's time to start doing this hobby again that I stopped doing, maybe because I was depressed. So in addition to just grabbing yourself by the shoelaces and pulling yourself up, there becomes I have this list of things now that I have to start doing a little at a time to reprogram my brain's chemistry for happy things. That's what we do when, it's not just climbing to the edge of the pit, but it's also looking around the pit and saying, well, this is not really where I want to be in my life anyway. So maybe here's what I need to do to make some positive changes.
Yeah.
And then hang on to that for dear life and don't let it become, this bipolar cycle of, okay, I'm going to do all this stuff now and then bang, right back again.
Right.
So, there's a danger to that, but at the same time, sometimes that's how it ends today may not be how it ultimately ends later on. So that when we're all going to have days where we still feel like not getting out of bed, but the idea is that those days become fewer and fewer because generally we have a reason to get up. Oh, I'm going to get up. I'm going to do this happy thing that makes me happy. And I'm already happy about it because my chemistry is aligned to where I'm going to go do this happy stuff. And it may just be, going out and making a bunch of sawdust in my wood shop. I swear that sawdust is the best antidepressant there is, but it's all about just being in an environment where I don't have to think about anything other than the thing that I'm doing at the time, the little piece of wood that I'm making or whatever it is that I'm building. That's all I have to think about. And all this other toxic stuff, I can take that 2% and I can distance myself from it.
Yeah.
So
for me, it's my gardens. When COVID hit, I've been a backyard organic gardener for decades. When COVID hit, I almost doubled my garden because it was the one thing and the one place that I could do and go that would bring some peace and balance into my life. And the toxicity of all the craziness that was going on, I could step out of that for a while.
Right. And whatever those things may be, I have 2 pet chickens. Now, having pet chickens, I started playing with them when they were little bitty cheapies. And anything that's a baby and you play with it, it will develop a personality. It doesn't matter how stupid the animal is. And believe me, a chicken's way down there on the food chain. But they develop these little quirky things that you can observe. And then the way that they interact with me, because I played with them since they were little, they don't know any better.
Sure.
And when you get home, the chicken doesn't care what kind of day you had. It doesn't care if you're happy or sad. It's a chicken. It wants to be fed. It wants to scratch around and do chicken things.
Right.
So sometimes that, having a dog, having a cat, whatever it is that, or having a garden, having a woodworking project, you have to have something that brings your life back to some manner of equilibrium. You got to have your zero state.
Yeah.
And believe me, when you sit in the backyard and try to have an actual conversation with a chicken that has a brain the size of a pea, then that's a zero state if there ever was one. But sometimes that's good.
I've never known anyone with pet chickens. I've always had dogs.
Yeah, I'm a dog person. I'm not a cat person. My daughter has a cat, and I hate it. But it's to each his own.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a place called Farm Sanctuary. They have actually sanctuaries in several parts of the country, and I visited one of them and spent time around the turkeys. And I'd been a vegetarian, but off and on. But after that, I went, not even a question. These animals have personalities and so, but I get it. I totally understand.
Yeah.
We are out of time, and we didn't really get to talk about your 6-book series, Medic, and I'd like to have you come back and talk about that sometime if we could. But I
think that would definitely be a lot of fun. And I'd say take a read at Northwest of Eden if you're so inclined, because it's a very interesting psychological case study.
I'm definitely intrigued, and it was fascinating as you were talking about your experiences there, because I flashed back to episodes of MASH when they were doing some of the things that you were just talking about. So it was more representative than I would have imagined.
One of the most brilliant TV shows ever made in terms of what war's really like, because they did a lot of waiting in between.
Yeah.
And it was all just about keeping sane until the next wave of it hit.
Yeah. And then keeping sane through that.
Right.
There's so much more we can talk about. I definitely would like to have you come back. But I really appreciate all of what you said, because you put it in ways that I would not have said it, that I think a lot of people can relate to. So thank you very, very much for that. Your perspective is just really valuable, and I appreciate that.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to share it. I hope, sometimes it may give somebody the aha moment that they need to say, oh, you know what, maybe this is how I can get out of this cycle, and how I can, how I can be more productive and just be happier. Life is just way too short to do anything that you're not happy doing.
I would say also, life's too short to suffer through it. There are reasons and opportunities for joy, and
absolutely,
we get to go for it.
Even if it's a chicken.
Even if it's a chicken, exactly. Thank you very, very, very much. I appreciate it. We will definitely be talking again soon.
Sure thing.